Welcome, government. Today we're going to be talking about the Constitutional Convention, also known as the Philadelphia Convention, because it took place in Philadelphia. And as you can probably guess, the Constitutional Convention was a meeting in which the new Constitution for the United States was proposed and then written and later to be ratified. This occurred from May 25th through September 17th of 1787, which was a long span of time, so it gives you an idea of the great sense of importance that they placed on the document. Before we talk about the meat of the matter, I'll let you know a little bit about the conditions at the Constitutional Convention. First of all, it was very hot. There were a bunch of older gentlemen who were stuffed in a brick building with the windows closed. There was a lot of intense debate, arguing going on between various members from different states over what they thought should and shouldn't be included. And many members at the Constitutional Convention even threatened to leave. Framers is the term used to refer to those who framed or who put together the Constitution. And the framers included a group of 55 delegates from 13 states, or the 13 states at the time. They're sometimes referred to as an assembly of demigods, which gives you, again, an idea of their importance and the level of their expertise and education and knowledge on government at the time period. They took some of the oldest fundamentals of democracy and weaved them into what is today the longest running and I would argue most successful democracy of all time. James Madison is a very important figure that we'll point out and you should be familiar with from the convention itself. He is known as the father of the Constitution. Why is that the case? Well, Mr. Madison was responsible for writing the largest portion of the Constitution, and he contributed many of the great ideas that went into it. George Washington, of course, is another very important figure to note at the meeting. Washington was easily the most trusted gentleman in the United States at the time, and he was the president of the convention, so he led the meetings. Some of the procedures that they followed at the convention, first of all, each state had one vote, so regardless of size, population, or wealth, each state was given one vote. So all delegates from each state had to come together in an agreement and cast their vote. There was also a rule of secrecy at the convention. So when you left the hall, whose windows were closed for a reason, you could not tell any reporters or any people on the street what had been discussed that day. And finally, a majority had to be present in order for them to conduct business at the convention. If there wasn't a majority, then they basically had to adjourn their meeting and call it a day. The Constitutional Convention is the origin of the Constitution, as we mentioned, so they went there with a purpose, and initially they thought maybe we can revise the Articles of Confederation, that previous Constitution, or the first Constitution that the U.S. had. And I like to think of the Articles of Confederation as a rough draft for government in the United States. But very shortly it became obvious that the framers were going to have to write a new constitution to better fit their needs and wants of government. They also made the important decision that government would consist of three branches. Those are the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Not necessarily in any particular order. They were supposed to be and are supposed to be three co-equal branches. Of course, this was different from the Articles of Confederation, in which there was only one branch of government, the legislative branch, or a Congress. But now we had an executive to enforce those laws made by Congress and a judicial branch to interpret the laws passed by Congress. One of the big issues for debate at the convention was representation, or how would the states and the citizens of those states be represented. We had two main plans that were vying in the competition here. The first was the Virginia plan. The Virginia plan proposed a bicameral Congress. What that means, bicameral, is two houses. So bi meaning two, cameral meaning houses. So in other words, there would be two chambers, or two sections to the Congress. And in both sections of the Virginia Plan Congress, representation would be based on population or money donated. So the number of representatives a state got, or the number of votes a state got, would be based on the number of citizens they had. And that was good news for a large state like Virginia, who had a large portion of the 13 states' population at the time. The second plan that was well known was the New Jersey plan. The New Jersey plan advocated for a unicameral Congress, or a one-house Congress. And in New Jersey's plan, they called for equal representation for each state, meaning that regardless of the state's size in terms of population, each state would be given the same number of votes. So if New Jersey got one vote, Virginia got one vote. Or if New Jersey got 5, Virginia got 5. Now this was, as I said, a very large discussion as how to represent the states, and ultimately they compromised in what became known as the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise. And in the Great Compromise, they decided to have a bicameral or two-house Congress. One house would be based on population, just like the Virginia plan proposed. And this today is the House of Reps, where the number of representatives each state gets is dependent upon the number of citizens in that state. And in the second house, which today we call the Senate, representation was based on state equality. So in today's Senate, every state gets 2 senators, regardless of the population size. So Iowa has 2 senators, while California has 2 senators, and North Dakota has 2 senators. Meanwhile, in the House of Reps, Iowa currently has 4 reps. California has roughly 53 reps, and so you see the large disparity in population reflected there. But the Connecticut Compromise, or the Great Compromise as it came to be known, was a major step forward in producing a constitution that all states could agree upon. 3/5 Compromise further emphasized the role of compromise in the convention, getting all 13 states on the same page. The big question here was, should slaves be counted toward the state's populations? The North said, no, certainly not. Only free persons should be counted. However, the North did want to count slaves for the purpose of taxation. The South said, yes, slaves should count towards a state's population. However, the South didn't want to count them towards taxes. This makes sense to us since we know the North did not have slaves, and so they would not have benefited from counting slaves. And the South did have a large proportion of slaves, which made it more favorable for them to count them. The compromise was just as it says, that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person. They were also taxed as 3/5 of a person by Congress under the plan. And by doing this, both sides were given part of what they want, and compromise allowed, again, the Constitution to be drafted and to be supported by both sides, the North and the South in this case. Ultimately, we see that the Constitution was a bundle of compromises, and sometimes it's referred to as a bundle of compromises. And once again, this demonstrates the importance of compromise in government. And when we have multiple sides, whether it's north, south, or 13 very distinct and individual states with separate needs, that we can reach an agreement that benefits the whole in the best way, while not completely giving up the ideas of all separate parties involved. And that is the Constitutional Convention in a nutshell.